story about growing gifted creativity. The problem that I noticed this year was that there were a low number of students that were being referred for gifted services at my school, Rawlings Elementary. When I reviewed the queue, there was just a really low number. I think I counted like 37 total in the whole school that had been screened in the last couple years. And even fewer qualifying. It was a really low, like I think I had 11, started out with 11 students at the other school in the gifted program. And then there was a lack of creativity and critical thinking strategies explicitly taught in general education classes. So this made me wonder, with everything going on in the county, the superintendent's got a directive now that we need to have a model for servicing the top 10% of students at Title I schools. The purpose of that is to make sure that those kids are also having an adequate amount of growth and that their needs are being met just as much as our lowest 10%. And that they changed our title at Title I schools are no longer gifted teachers, but not gifted and talented. So this is my wondering, how will conducting small, creative, and critical thinking groups affect the number of students qualifying for gifted services? The methods I used were bi-weekly creative and critical thinking strategies in groups by grade level, and this happened during their Walk to Success time. And the teacher sent me like their high readers or high math students. Every teacher kind of used a different criteria on who they sent to me, and it was fun. For critical thinking skills, I used brain stations, which had a variety of activities. Some were where you ask things like, which one's the yo-yo, which one could be, so you're kind of seeing different objects and pictures. Some were creative, where they would have to, I would give them pieces of something and they would have to create a project. Some of them were like listing things just to see what they could do. And then the other product I used was called Creativity Calendar, and it focused on, and then the other product I used was called Creativity Calendar, and it focused on fluency, flexibility, originality, and elaboration. And those are just 4 different kinds of strategies that help with creativity. So that each student had a journal that we used to record all of our thinking so that I could see patterns over time. And then I also used an observational data graphic organizer that had different categories of ways of thinking or behaviors that might come up to kind of cue a teacher into thinking processes or gifted characteristics. And then I interviewed the kids several times throughout specific questions like, what is your definition of creativity, or which activity do you like the best and why, things like that, to just get some feedback. And then I was really focusing on 10 students who had been referred for gifted and that were awaiting an IQ test called the RIAS, which is the Reynolds Intelligence Assessment Scale. My findings were that there was an increase in comfort of activity over time. Some of the kids had never done activities like these, and so they were very uncomfortable because they wanted to always find a right answer. And they wanted, which was one positive out of that, is a lot of them wanted to justify their thinking because we focus so much in Gen Ed on Common Core and that justification. In creativity, you don't always have to justify the way you're thinking something. So as long as you're able to describe why it fits the thing, so it's it was like that they relaxed into it. As long as you're able to describe why it fits the thing, so it's it was like that they relaxed into it, and there was some comfort. Their greatest growth was in the area of fluency and flexibility, I think because they were already comfortable, and so they were able to just shoot off with it. Fluency and flexibility are brainstorming techniques where you generate lots of ideas within categories, and so because of the connection with brainstorming and writing and brainstorming and science, I think they were really comfortable. And then their topic of interest was affected by performance. If I ever gave them something that they just didn't know, have a lot of back knowledge on, or that they just didn't like, they didn't shut down, but they just didn't generate as much. And then their favorite strategies were originality and elaboration. Originality is activities where, like the last one we did was, it's the end of the school year, you worked really hard, and so design a certificate that you would earn, name it, describe it, and then draw a picture of it. And so like a new activity. And then elaborations where they take something and then they change it using a mnemonic called Scamper. So you might take like a turkey or Thanksgiving dinner, and then how can you change it? Substitute things in, combine different things to make some kind of new celebration. 10 of the students waiting for their REOS during the data collection time, 4 of them were actually tested, and 2 of them qualified for services, but we're still waiting on the other 6 kids to be tested. So this is a graphic of the fluency thinking strategy. These are the 2 students who actually qualified for gifted. They started off high and they grew. They plummeted when they didn't like the topic, and then they really they continued to become more and more comfortable, and so generating more and more ideas. And then the other 8 all showed growth in their ability to generate ideas, but they just didn't have as many. The first week being able to generate 30 ideas in a topic versus this was like 2 or 3. And then you have some kids who just really skyrocket right here, where it finally seemed to click and make sense. So my reflections on the effectiveness of this teaching creativity directly. The pros were that the gifted referrals at Rawlings Elementary really increased. I think once I was able to notice outside the box thinking, I was able to go to a teacher and talk to them about what other characteristics they might be demonstrating in class. And then once teachers started to understand what I was doing and started to learn about gifted characteristics, we suddenly got a lot more referrals. 50% of the kids that were evaluated for gifted actually made it in and received services, qualified for services. There was a lot of humor and invigorating conversation during our small group work. And then the kids expanded their definition of creativity. They started off thinking creativity was just about art, music, and then by the end, they were thinking that creativity could include mathematicians and architects and doctors and just people who create problems. All right, so the cons for my inquiry were that there was a highly interrupted schedule because of testing. They were testing just about every week that I had in there. And my room was an ESOL resource room, so anytime there was testing, I had to go somewhere else. And oftentimes there wasn't anywhere else to go, so we had to cancel class. There was a bi-weekly schedule. It was really ineffective to only service kids every other week. I know they're getting something, but it's not consistent enough. By the time I saw them again, 2 weeks had passed, and some of them, it was hard to refresh their memory of where we were doing. Right, yeah, we did that, remember? And it wasn't as effective. I think we would see a lot more growth with at least weekly sessions. And then the evaluation process for the REOS is really lengthy. By the time they're screened, they're referred, they're screened, and then there's 90 school days before they have to get the REOS. So it's just too lengthy. And then the method of student choice for participation in my groups was really different from teacher to teacher. So I got all kinds of different kids that I don't know that it necessarily represented the top 10% of the student body. And it was grades 1 through 5. Any questions? All right. Thank you. Okay, so even though I took my video yesterday and it's just shy of 10 minutes, so I wanted to take a minute. My coworkers didn't ask many questions in the video, but afterwards we were talking, and the woman who was holding the camera for me, she asked a really good question about whether or not I really felt that working on creativity was reflective of the type of questions that might be asked on a RIAS. So my answer to her was, I don't really know what's on the RIAS because we're not allowed to see the test ever, which is, for validity that needs to happen. But we do know that there's some games on, some activities that work with guess what's missing and spatial sequential puzzles and things like that. And although I didn't do that with my kids, we worked on some activities. I use this book called Thinking Skills Resources, and to do different activities. And one of the things that we did do were syllogisms. Syllogisms. I never say it right. But there are things like all trout are fish, all fish swim, therefore trout can swim. And we talk about whether or not that's a valid statement or not. So we did some verbal activities like that I feel if kids are really learning how to think through problems like that and touch more vocabulary and asked to solve problems that they don't know the answers to, we are going to see more kids activating parts of their brain that they maybe don't get a chance to activate in a traditional classroom setting where teacher talks, we practice, and then we do, and then independent, and then there's a test. The creative thinking and critical thinking skills that I work on sometimes are very untraditional. It looks messy and it's noisy in the room, and the kids are fully engaged and having a good time, but it doesn't always look very traditional. So I feel like the inquiry went really well. However, it's just a really ineffective model. If they're going to work this kind of thinking skill in, I think it's a great thing, and it's only going to benefit our children, but it needs to happen weekly, if not just once a week. It needs to happen every time there's the Walk to Success small groups. I think in that way you'll see a lot of growth. The gifted teachers and the gifted and talented program teachers in the Title I schools have tons of resources. We have books like this one, and we have books about asking good questions and evaluating questions. And although I think those benefit the gifted kids, I think it could also benefit our top 10% kids who never quite qualify. We have a lot of kids sitting in that 125, 126, 127 IQ. They just fall short of receiving services, but they need something more to activate that thinking, and it'll push them so that we can take the ceiling off of their learning and really see where they can go. I think that I will continue to look at this and study this, since this is a new directive, and see where this takes me next year, and see how more consistent, if there's a way to get a more consistent schedule.